Good evening, everyone. So great to see you all here in the room. I mean, really, you are the troopers. Here we are on the third day of conferencing at the end of the day, and you're all here. Welcome to our session today on accountability through a gendered lens. Every panel that I've attended in the past 3 days has begun with the panelists speaking about how great it is to be back in a room with people. And so I'd also like to begin there and express my appreciation to be able to be here with all of you here today in a room, to thank IJF for putting this together and for bringing us all together, not just for an important professional event, but also I think for all of us an important personal event for us to be able to reconnect after the difficulties and challenges of the past 2 years. My name is Fatemah Farag. I am the founder and director of Welad Elbalad, which is a local media company in Egypt, but I'm privileged to be here today in my capacity as senior consultant for WAN-IFRA's Women in News program. Today's topic is accountability through a gendered lens. What it is that we'd like to talk about? Well, first of all, accountability. Obviously, within this age of misinformation, the issue of trust and the accountability of news organizations has really come to the fore. It's like we're always dealing, it seems, in buzzwords. It was fact-checking for a while and still is to a great extent. Sustainability is big on the agenda as well, and now accountability again is coming to the fore. These have always been, I think, important components of journalism and how we do our business. But what we're, I think, pointing to now is that they are particularly important in being able to move forward in ways that service our public and our readers. So that's the accountability part. But another buzzword has been gender and gender mainstreaming. And while we all probably would agree that gender mainstreaming is key and important to all of us, we'll find that gender is always discussed aside. And even if we look at the agenda of the past several days, all of the gender topics were discussed in separate panels, but rarely are they discussed in connection to other issues of importance that relate to the profession. And so here we are now, breaking down that silo in this panel today and saying that no, actually where we need to talk about gender is right here. When we talk about accountability, when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about misinformation, this is gender mainstreaming. And so we hope that this also sets a standard, perhaps, for thinking about gender and talking about gender in the future. My experts today on this panel, I'd like to introduce, beginning with Mira Milosevic, Director of the Global Fund for Media Development.
Forum.
And it's the end of the day, so you excuse my blunder. Ayman Mhanna, who is the Executive Director of the Samir Kassir Foundation from Lebanon, and Melanie Walker, the Executive Director of WAN-IFRA's Women in News program. Welcome to you all, and let's do a deep dive straight away. Starting with you, Mira, if we could talk about when we say accountability now within this context, what is it exactly that we are talking about, and what is the relevance also of the work that the forum does with regards to accountability? Beginning with you.
Thank you, Fatemah, and it's such a pleasure to be here. Global Forum for Media Development, for those of you who don't know, is a network of more than 120 organizations in over 50 countries around the world. And I'm so happy that Melanie, Ayman, and Fatemah lead organizations that are our members. And we really cooperate closely with them on many, many initiatives. In the context of gender, we have a representative status at the UN, so we help our members to reach those policy actors on higher levels. So we did together panels at the Commission for Status of Women a couple of years ago. We promote what WAN-IFRA does in their program, Women in News. There was just previously a panel organized by ICFJ and Julie Possetti and Ranaya talked about online harassment of women. They've done a couple of fantastic reports, etc. So we both bring organizations to learn from each other and present their best practices. processes, but we also help them do policy and advocacy. And as we all know, there is still a long way to go in terms of pushing some of the issues to be mainstreamed, and gender equality and diversity are some of the issues that we are looking at. So back to accountability, I made a bit of an intro, but back to accountability. It's really interesting to speak about accountability of media companies when media and journalists are usually those that, as we say, hold power to account. And so how does it look when we turn that mirror to ourselves, and how transparent, accountable, what is our credibility and integrity? And just a bit of a definition that I found, that when we talk about accountability, it is usually a normative category that looks at balance between, our freedom. It can be a market freedom or freedom to decide without thinking about many of the social responsibilities. And so looking at that balance, what are the social responsibilities and what are the freedoms? And in terms of media, you can look at three levels. It's media structure, performance, and product. So it's also very important to kind of understand what we are talking about in structure. Of course, it's governance systems. And what we have seen in many areas, including gender, is that that free market approach often fails to secure respect for human rights often, what we call public interest. And you can tell me when I'm crossing 7 minutes, just say, yeah.
I'll tell you, don't worry.
So that's around the accountability definition. And this is why when we talk about different companies, but including media companies, we often need additional frameworks and mechanisms for accountability, so that those public interests and responsibility towards audiences and citizens are observed. And then, of course, now if we look at the research, what interests me is how, for instance, accountability looks in media companies at the governance level, at the level of processes and policies. And Professor Dr. Elena Herrero-Beaumont has done some really interesting research for many of the organizations that we work with on transparency and governance, and on transparency and accountability of media companies. And one of her reports, recent ones, called The Front Page, looked at 20 media companies in Spain. And it's interesting that she found that most of these companies that she analyzed in depth do not disclose relevant information about their owners. The governance and compliance systems are not transparent. Their risk control, their self-regulation codes, there are kind of systems lacking across all these categories. And this is exactly where gender sits. If you don't have systems to monitor what your policy is, and if you don't have systems to disclose the compliance and measure it, and if you don't have a system to be transparent about it on a regular basis, then, of course, there are no incentives within the company for those things to be truly implemented. So this is kind of just to open the discussion. This is the framework to look at the governance. And then, of course, we can talk about performance and product, and I'm sure that Ayman and Melanie will talk more about that.
Thank you, Mira. That's a great opening of this conversation. And Ayman, I'd like to move to you, because again, this opens up this issue of when we look at this also within its regional iterations. We're already working within very opaque sort of media environments. There's a high risk associated also with various measures of disclosure. How does this apply to various regions, and is it relevant?
There is nothing more relevant than including every member of society. So regardless of where we sit, where we work, where we stand in the world, I'll try to focus on the region where we operate more, which is the Middle East and North Africa. But before doing this, let's try to simplify, for example, the question of accountability. How does usually accountability materialize, manifest? What are the mechanisms? You have laws. In most, if not all countries in our region, laws are exclusively designed by men. Tribunals, while you have a very high number of young women in law schools, these numbers do not translate whenever you reach the higher echelons of the judiciary. Press councils are usually a reflection of the political elite and very rarely truly freely elected by the community. Unions that are usually even more than press councils, completely controlled by the old political parties that are exclusively managed by undemocratic men, and social media networks. This is a new accountability scene, but where you have electronic armies connected to the most violent political parties, all male-dominated,
Right.
who also unleash their power of nuisance online, and very often to target women who dare, as journalists in particular, open new topics. So these are the traditional accountability mechanisms. Every time we speak about accountability, and we see that especially in our region, but I'm sure it's the case in many other regions, they're not necessarily very friendly to a gender-inclusive perspective. However, I'm optimistic by nature, there are definitely sources of hope, especially in a region where there is an emergence, a very vivid emergence of independent, new digital native media initiatives that have emerged as a reaction to the old school of doing journalism. You run one of these examples with Welad Elbalad in Egypt. And if we start giving some examples, I won't give a full list of examples, you'll realize that suddenly some of the most innovative of these initiatives are owned and or managed as editor-in-chief by very talented women. Mada Masr in Egypt, Daraj in Lebanon, Beirut Today in Lebanon, and so many other examples from Syria, from Jordan, Arij in Jordan as a major example for investigative journalism. In Intifada, women play a major role in leading the organization. So what is common with these new independent initiatives that are trying to break out of the old mold? Ethical standards that were decided within these organizations that include integrity policies, that integrate as well aspects related to discrimination, aspects related to harassment, aspects related to behavior among colleagues within the same team. These new initiatives actually also rely on colleagues to be accountable to one another in how they cover certain aspects. Also, they're not always a bad word. Donors, some of the very well-intentioned donors with a strong expertise in the field, because they also come from long experience in media development, have also helped new organizations integrate some of these components related to accountability with a gender focus. Also part of the audience on social media is actually reacting in a positive way, because finally, these media outlets are reflecting stories and narratives that do not come from the traditional male-dominated elite, but stories of communities, of marginalized communities, women-led communities, LGBT communities in areas of the world where all these words are difficult to handle and difficult to cover. So there is a source of hope. And my last point, and probably we'll come back to it later, in order to make sure that these new hope-inducing initiatives create a new reality for accountability with a gender lens in our region and probably inspire others in the world, this is where work on sustainability becomes essential again. Because if we do not work to help these very positive initiatives become sustainable and think about sustainability in the most inclusive way, and not only financial sustainability, we will fail our readers, we will fail the women in these newsrooms, we will fail also our aspiration to democracy and to freedom in our region. So sustainability is not only about not requesting new funding from a donor, it's about including people who have been excluded from funding and financing journalism to the game. Who was excluded so far? The only people in our region involved in funding the media are politicians, and again, male-dominated, donors, not a bad word, but it's not enough. Two categories are missing, and everything in our work right now is to try to include them. The audience. Does subscription work, not work? Well, if we're creative about it, it does work. And I'll quickly give one example. L'Orient Le Jour, a Lebanese newspaper that is 100 years old, in French, paper. Every single recipe for disaster, for collapse. It's one of the only media outlets that is making money today in Lebanon because they understood how we can engage with an audience in a new and creative way. And advertisers, again, free market alone cannot help journalism, but without connecting with like-minded people in the private sector and involving them through a new way of thinking advertisement to the sector, we cannot be sustainable. And in these two sectors, specifically the audience that actually is now more, the upper middle class, the educated middle class, whomever you want to call, or ethical businesses, you will also see a much stronger women representation and a society that is, or actually a community that better reflects society. So if we bring them to the mix, I think we'll be on the right track.
Wow, thank you, Ayman, for that. And there are several points that we'll definitely be coming back to, but there was something that you said. So newsrooms that are led by women show better accountability, show better journalism, show better practice.
Let's call there is a very strong correlation.
I'm quoting you here.
Let's say there is a very strong correlation.
Right.
Because is it because they are led by women, or the fact that you had shareholders or founders who agreed to value competence, who agreed to make sure that people are judged based on the quality of their work rather than any other component? Well, it opens a virtuous cycle of good journalistic practices, of accountability, etc. So I would not enter into the game of chicken and the egg, but these two things go in parallel.
Great, and I think that's a great point for you to pick up from Melanie. If you could please take it from there, and also tell us a bit more also about women in news.
Sure. Happy to. Can you hear me properly? There we go, my mic is on. Well, so I love this optimism, and you very much are an optimistic individual, Ayman, and we need people like you to be constantly looking at the glass half full. And I am here to also put a little bit of a damper on some of those positive elements, because
Saturday evening.
no, it's Saturday evening. It's raining outside. It's almost cocktail hour. But through Women in News, WAN-IFRA, which is the World Association of News Publishers, has been working in this space for over a decade. Recognizing, and the whole start of this program, which now has grown to include 18 countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, as well as the Arab region, is that we recognize that we in the media industry were of the worst when it came to diversity and inclusion, specifically gender. We could see it in our boards, we could see it in the newsrooms. For WAN-IFRA, we could see it reflected in our own membership base and our boards. And so we decided that we needed to change that from within. WAN-IFRA has always held the philosophy that economic independence of media is a cornerstone of press freedom. If you are not sustainable as a business, if you cannot survive, if you cannot find the way to pay your employees to remain independent outside of state interference, then you can't really protect your content, your press freedom. And so this has always been a guiding principle in all of our development work. Because of that, and because of this recognition of the fact that the media industry had a lot of work to do when it comes to gender balance, the Women in News program was launched, and it was very integrated. Viability, media viability combined with gender balance, looking at policy change, looking at widening the pipeline for female talent to equip high potential women managers with the skills, the strategies, the support networks to succeed when they could attain higher positions, speaking directly with top management about the importance of creating environments for their staff to succeed. We've been doing this for 10 years. We have seen some real strides, but the overall picture for the industry and anyone who's attended any of the panels that focus on gender over the past 3 days knows that we have so far to go. In 15 years, that figure of 1 in 4 women either being quoted as sources, contributing as authors, being the protagonists of stories, has not changed. 15 years, and we've been working on this. We're talking about this. The Reuters Research Institute study that has been doing leadership mapping actually showed a decline year over year of the number of women holding top editorial positions. In 2020, it was 22%. Still, really not a great figure. And in 2021, that's fallen now to 21%. Looking at that and talking about accountability, we also, in these conversations, realize there's another whole area that the media industry really needs to focus on and hold itself to account on, and that is sexual harassment and creating environments that are safe for all employees to go to work and to be free from harassment. We recently released a large-scale research survey, or search on that looked at 18 different countries, 20 different countries, interviewed more than 85 senior executives, had over 2,000 individuals respond to an anonymous survey, and the findings were really shocking, probably not surprising to many women journalists who might be in the room today. 40% of all women journalists claim that they had been sexually harassed, either verbally or physically, throughout their career. Disturbingly, more than 10% had been harassed more than 5 times. When they actually chose to report, only 20%, and this is across every single region, very consistent, only 20%, 1 in 5, choose to report. And in that circumstance, that 1 in 5, only half the time when a complaint is made at the organizational level, is there a formal response. So response usually was either a verbal addressment or the individual who filed the complaint was moved to a different division. None of this is good enough. And when we're talking about trust, when we're talking about accountability, when we know that our brand as media, trust is the utmost. If we lose the trust, our brand goes. If we lose the audiences and we're not reflecting the audiences in the content we're producing, we are not going to be sustainable. We're not going to survive. And we have to really deal with this in a very, very comprehensive way. And that's not going to happen unless we start combining, as the purpose of this panel, we need to start talking about gender, mainstreaming it into any other conversation we have about accountability, sustainability.
Thank you, Melanie. So that was sobering. And discussing this issue of sustainability, several things have been said here. Free market, advertisers, audiences as part of that mix towards independent sustainability. Often these are actors that are not necessarily supportive of gender equality, when they aren't. I remember a comment made to me by a leader of a newsroom. He was like, I'm not, the trust doesn't come from necessarily being gender just from my audience. And definitely I'm not being measured by my gender equality measures or my accountability measures. I'm being measured by how much I'm making, how much traffic I'm bringing in, and that's for me sustainability, and it doesn't necessarily correlate to accountability or to gender equality. How would you respond to that? How do you see that? Because that's sort of something that's said on the ground a lot.
Would you like me? Yeah, it's a vicious circle. Mm-hmm. If the major incentive for both media organizations and today new digital tech companies and social media, if the major economic motivation and major incentive is profit, and it's built throughout the structures as the the kind of structure, how you measure performance of employees, how you create their salaries and bonuses and things like that. It's, as you say, clicks and the most sensational content that will be chased. And then everything else is an afterthought, and it's not built into the system. So that's one layer. The other layer is absolutely shocking lack of transparency in the system, for instance, of advertising for the big tech, we call it ad tech system. I've recently read that only 20% of all advertising that goes through Google ad tech exchanges, and this is the biggest in the world. So if out of $300 billion of digital advertising, Google ad tech exchanges probably process around 40–50%. So it's huge. It's the money that media industry can only dream about. And so we know only 20% of destinations where the advertising ends up. And so the whole advertising industry actually funds some websites, some media companies that not only we don't know what their transparency, corporate governance, we don't know who they are. And so it's very difficult even to kind of measure how they treat different topics, who they are. I mean, many of them are organized networks for disinformation. Many of them are organized networks for, selling child pornography. And so that's addressed the best, and I'm mistaken there, actually. I apologize. This is one area that's addressed in digital very well, but there are other areas that are not. So yeah, that's something that I think needs correcting when we speak about big tech urgently. And of course, then there are issues around the programmers and everything that's designed, from the algorithm to the end product. Right. We have all kinds of biases and lack of diversity. And then how do they internally also address gender? I just read this interesting research where it's all based on individual, and it's also training women to think more like men.
Yes. And Melanie, if you could address this, Women in News is designed to incorporate sustainability as part of promoting gender equality within the newsroom. So, I mean, is there a challenge here? What is that challenge? And is there resistance from partner organizations around this understanding that these two go hand in hand?
I think it's not, and just as bias is implicit, you have to be very explicit in recognizing that you might have inherent bias, and that you might need to pay more attention to something because it's not going to come naturally. And any change that you do want to bring about, and we do a lot of work on the organizational strategy and helping to build operational design as well. As soon as you start sort of breaking down the barriers and to have those conversations that need to happen, then it has to start at the top. The CEO, the managing director, is the one who can set and who can change the organizational culture. So if you can get in there and you can have that conversation in a very practical way, gender equality, diversity and inclusion, it's not just a good thing, it's good for business. It's good for the strength of an organization. It's, it feeds through the content you produce to better serve your audiences. There's a whole narrative thread there that is both logical as well as the right thing to do. And I think that, once you start to change the mindset, the obvious question is, okay, well, what do we do? And, luckily we do have tools that we've been working on to help media, sort of chip away at it. Like, change doesn't happen overnight. And, there are different tools and different approaches, and everyone is resource strapped. But with consistent engagement and dialogue, we have started to see much more receptiveness, and also an openness to work with us to help to improve, whether it's fully mainstreaming a gender strategy throughout the organization when it comes to hiring policies, or updating sexual harassment policies to take them to make them more robust, to have action plans that are associated and guidelines, to do a lot of the training, and it is very important to also ensure that you're addressing each level of the organization. So you've got to get to the C-suite, and you need to get to the managers, and then you get to the newsroom, and it can filter down, but it's so important to hit all three levels. But it's a slow process. I mean, Women in News has been engaging with our partners for, we have 80 partners now in these 18 different countries, and it's slow. I think it's a slow march, and it's a reminder that change doesn't happen overnight. But if we continue at this glacial pace, we're going to be having these same conversations in 5 years and in 10 years, and it's just not acceptable. I think that it actually is, really detrimental to the sustainability of the media ecosystem as it is. Unless, all these wonderful sort of examples that Ayman was able to cite of new media coming out of the sort of legacy traditional media and, taking a new approach and adopting new approaches, and those will be the media that survive.
But Ayman, coming back to, sort of the light at the end of the tunnel and all of these positive examples, again, everyone is struggling with issues of financial viability and sustainability, and we are working within audiences and within an advertising market also, which is not on board with many of these efforts. So how do we deal with that?
In a way, it all depends on the constituency that the media outlet is trying to address. I hate to sound parochial when I focus on one region, but the examples that Melanie gave show that some trends exist everywhere. Very often, some of the worst performers in the field actually have a constituency of one, which is the person funding them. And some of these worst performers are funded by an individual businessman with political intentions, or someone who has to fund a newspaper because otherwise the army would arrest him, or because he or she, he is the emir or king of a certain monarchy. So in fact, the editor-in-chief, the manager of the newsroom, at the end can give you all the justifications and excuses about clicks and traffic. In fact, he only cares about the one and only constituency that they care about, the donor. So by creating systems where the constituency is no longer a constituency of one, but a constituency of many, and very reflective of the society, this is, I know it sounds easy when said and much more difficult to implement, but this is the difference between the media outlets that I was giving as an example. They understand that their constituency might be very limited to an urban elite, but it's no longer a constituency of one clearly defined person that they need to please. So now our work with them is not, for example, specifically related to developing their policy, but by making sure they are able to increase that constituency, they actually would give themselves more tools to find new ways of doing things, making sure that their constituency is always pleased by their work, and which means working to cover the interests, the narratives, the aspirations of everyone in their constituency. It's very difficult, of course, trying to find financial sustainability, institutional sustainability. Even the largest newspapers and media outlets in the world haven't found that magic bullet. But what I ask for is, let's get rid of ideology by saying free market is good, free market is bad. Donors are good or donors are bad. What is the most efficient mix for that particular region, for that particular media outlet, for that particular website? And let's be open-minded about it. Because when we say advertisement is bad, in general, even when we actually want advertisement or actually are definitely, I totally agree with Mira when it comes to how Google and Facebook handles their advertisement, we exclude from the market many great people. I'll give you a few examples. One of the initiatives we just launched in Lebanon and very soon in Tunisia and Jordan is called MEME, Market Innovation for Independent Media. The idea behind MEME is to bring advertisers to the mix. But which advertiser? Solar and we're here in Umbria, is a producer of excellent quality olive oil from Lebanon and is planning to export all over the world. And it's run by young men and women who are passionate about their land and the quality of their olive oil or the quality of their honey, although it doesn't match the one that Yemen produces, but still amazing olive oil, amazing, I mean, the food culture in Lebanon is so strong, and everywhere in the Middle East, with a huge diaspora that cares about their products, with also many people here who have tried our food and love it. So what if these people who cannot afford advertisement with the big advertising companies and actually don't really trust Facebook and Google to bring their advertisement to the right audience, what if we give them a very flexible mechanism where they can advertise in a panel of independent digital native media who also care about the values we were talking about? So we're bringing ethical companies that are inclusive in the way they work, that are giving money back to the community, including to the women working there, at the same time advertising in media outlets that care about gender and inclusion. We are creating the mechanism to make that advertisement possible for the Middle East. This is just one example. Another one is related to making subscription easy so that the traffic that is not coming to the newspaper you were mentioning, to the website you were mentioning, because we don't see them. Instead of asking people to go and have a bank card to subscribe to a media outlet, and we know that women, especially in the Middle East, are excluded from the banking system. What if we create a very simple top-up system similar to the one we have for our phones, where we can go to the grocery store or to the bookstore and buy for a very, not expensive price, a top-up card where we just have to enter the code and it unlocks access to a variety of content coming from so many media outlets without having to actually go through the banking system, etc. We're creating simple solutions for inclusion. Are they enough to change the numbers that Melanie mentioned? Absolutely not. We're very realistic about that. But what we need is your work at the policy side, your work inside the big newsrooms, and our work also with the tiny newcomers. So when we combine all these forces from the different directions, probably this is what will unlock some of the solutions.
So I really like this idea of an efficient mix. I mean,
Yeah.
this seems to, and it's hearing elements of this and entry points from all three of you around how to do that and to break down this vicious circle, which we often seem to feel that we're moving in. But can we do this effectively? And this is something that is going to take us time, even as we work at it very diligently and consistently. Can we have this? Can we have success without actually bringing the big players on board? And what is their role in all of this? I mean, when we talk about the big platforms, and often I think media companies feel like they are not really in control. We talk a lot, we have intentions, but at the end of the day, there's this superpower that's dominating a lot of what it is that we do. So can we afford not to have them and within this conversation, and to have them within this conversation, in what sense? What do we need?
Gosh, I can jump in.
Yeah.
You know,
And then we'll come to you here.
Absolutely. We absolutely need to be having these conversations with the big players, and they're recognizing and taking it quite seriously as well. And obviously, it would be so in the sense as well as donors, and which donors have started to do. And sort of as of 5 years ago, there were very clear metrics that donor recipients would need to adhere to be able to be eligible for funding, and that does have gender components. Often it's a sexual harassment policy, say, or some guidelines around your editorial guidelines. It would be very easy for one of the large big tech to just say, you know what, if we're going to do anything here in terms of any of our direct support or through advertising, you need to have this list of 5 indexes, and one of those includes gender equality, and what sort of policies and internal practices do you have in place? And then, it would be, I think very quickly there would be compliance.
Mira.
Yes, absolutely. I think that especially in digital world, these systems that exist are absolutely inadequate at the moment. So what we used to have was, for instance, public service broadcasters were regulated by law. There were some systems incorporated that were taking care about diversity and respect of basic standards, etc. And then we had self-regulation through ethical councils, and those were mechanisms that were working for accountability towards both the state and the audiences. You had representatives of the audiences in different media houses. And of course, as we see, a lot of these mechanisms didn't work perfectly, but they existed in kind of that interplay between what existed as regulation and what was the relationship with the audiences worked in the past. What we are seeing in digital is that credible, ethical, diverse, equitable media and journalism organizations are just not recognized. And they're not paid, they're not monetized, that they are not amplified, they are not recognized as a serious, positive player that needs affirmative action in the digital space. So what we are doing, we're looking at options how to do this in a structural way with big platforms. So for instance, when the invasion in Ukraine started, we started getting questions from the platforms. Do you have a list of credible, ethical, professional media in Ukraine? Because now we are in this horrible situation and we don't know who to amplify or who to kind of take as a credible source of information. And this is what we are trying to do, is to talk to them and say, well, listen, if you have a system for recognizing fact checkers, and there is an international network of fact checkers, there's so many mechanisms in our journalism and media field that you can take and say, okay, well, this is the organization that recognizes, gender standards, that recognizes diversity and everything else, ethical, and this is someone who needs to be our partner. And not only that, we need to monetize these partners because this is a quality for all our societies. That incentive doesn't exist, and I don't know, you wouldn't probably believe, but Facebook and Google have demonetized Russia Today, for instance, only a month ago. And that's only in certain markets. And you know that outlets in Lebanon, outlets in Yemen, in Moldova, in many countries are struggling to even get on the monetization program of many of these big tech companies. This is a huge battle that we need to win. And then that kind of brings those voices, your voice, to the table, and you bring those standards then, and then you sit with all those content creators and say, this is what we need to do to mainstream gender debate.
Yeah, leveling that playing field is something. Ayman, would you like to speak to this?
In a way, very often when there is a wave of terrorist attack, suddenly donors, international political organizations come to media and media development organizations asking us, oh, what can you do? Or there is a war. And very often people ask media to actually solve problems that are also outside the media circle. And this is actually one of the other examples. Oh, how can media bridge the gap? How can media? Well, absolutely media has to do it, but we need to understand that it's happening in an ecosystem that is not helping either. So while we're trying to do everything we outlined, there are other things that our colleagues in other sectors, our brothers and sisters, need to be also working on. And I'm going to mention lawyers and people in the law schools, etc. Tomorrow's problems will be very similar to the discussions in the 1960s and 70s about whether or not car companies need to add a seatbelt. So should we wait for the next huge disaster, political, human disaster, that is coming because of the horrible current policies of the big tech, etc., to suddenly wake up? So maybe they need to feel the heat coming from potential legal action that exists right now in a very sporadic way, but this is a thinking that needs to happen among young women and men lawyers, students, because this is the big fight, legal fight of the future. The same thing happening in the culture world. Today, of course, Netflix want to please a huge Saudi, huge Saudi prince, and in order to have access to an audience that is quite big and wealthy. But at the same time, through some of the so-called subversive content on Netflix, society can change. So how can we also connect with our friends in the culture field so they can also push through cinema, through movies, through music, that debate? Third element, women in politics. more women in politics, more focus on women in politics, women who also understand this agenda, because we need this voice in parliament, standing in front of an audience dominated by men to say these things. And finally, STEM, STEMs. As in science, technology, math, engineering. There is an amazing organization in the UK that's called STEMet. More organizations like that need to emerge all over the world, including in developing countries, to understand the value of how we teach science to young women in schools. We need to change how we speak about math to young women in schools, because it's the influx of young women in the STEM sector entering as, you know, employees of Google, Facebook, etc., or actually creating the next new startups that will change the same way Facebook and Google changed the way, will not come as long as our education system are based on excluding women, young girls, from STEM. Otherwise, many of the beautiful things we were talking about will not materialize. So yes, I'm much less optimistic right now than I was 30 minutes ago.
I've lost you. You mentioned Matrix. And so before I open up the floor, I'd sort of like to touch on the issue of the various matrix that are being put into place to hold us to account around sustainability indexes that are coming to the fore. Do these include gender at all, enough? Is this an area where we need to consider when thinking about how to ensure that gender is a part of this thinking moving forward? If any of you would like to?
Yes.
Yeah. We'll begin with you then.
No, just yes.
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 Oh, yes.
One of the examples we're working on, we're collaborating with, is, for example, the Journalism Trust Initiative, with the idea of trying to add more transparency about management, about quality issues, about, you know, internal policies, and trying to engage with, you know, the big tech in a discussion about, look, these are yes and no answers. And if they are yes and no answers, it's quite easy for even young people to turn them into algorithms that will be integrated in, you know, the SEO. So would, you know, let's make sure that something coming from a media organization that is transparent about its owners, sources of funding, policies, and abide by criteria of, you know, equality and inclusion, well, without needing to put so much money into boosting, let their result appear slightly before organizations that are just paying money but that are opaque about everything else. This is a very serious and simple conversation. ISO has it in the management and industry. Why not have it in our media sector as well? This is just one track.
Okay, so this is one example of where the conversation is happening. But we do have matrix that are out there that, you know, do these include gender? Yes?
I mean, you know, the ones that I have seen, if they're not, you know, they're still follow their own point and sort of their own pillar, let's say, if you're looking at the different pillars that you would. And so there's question of, is it more effective to try to integrate and mainstream into all of the other pillars so that it's, you know, more fluid rather than being put in a box. But you know, those that I have seen, yes, and certainly the ones that we use internally when we do work with our partners on stability and the sort of pillars of digital stability, absolutely, you know, gender is right throughout.
Yes.
I'll talk about something else quickly before we go to questions. I think that there is also, not very often we talk about our organizations and how we, especially as women managers, manage them. And how do we create the working conditions for our colleagues, both genders, to have, you know, family-friendly environment, how we worked through pandemics to make sure that they don't suffer from, you know, not having enough time to do homeschooling, everything that people had to do. How do we make our governance structures fair, diverse, equal, and understanding for what the new workplace that's tailored towards our differences and commonalities looks like, and how we then make it sustainable, you know, and what are the best practices in that respect. I'm just looking there, my colleagues who do research in Serbia, and they just shared with me one of the latest researches there that even though women are have 57% of all employees in newsrooms, great majority, suffer from constant stress, anxiety, and all the other problems that we mentioned. So that's another dimension that I think we should make space to talk about, how to do this in the best possible way, both in the media sector, but also in the non-profit sector. I think we can set standards there as well.
Yes, very valid, of course. Well, I'd like to open it up for questions. Yes, please.
My name is Mira Milosevic. I'm Executive Director of Media Diversity Institute London. And Mira and Ayman, I'm so pleased that you are talking about these topics because we've been talking for 25 years about this. Do not, number one, separate gender from the other diversity issues. Because if you are not sensitive to ethnic minorities or people with disabilities, you will have no sensitivity towards any gender issues. So there is that kind of intersectionality or solidarity, old word. So that has to be there all the time. Number two, I've been listening to all sessions at this festival related to diversity, and somehow diversity is taken as yet another issue. And diversity is not yet another issue. It's there. It's our newsrooms. It's in our content. It's who runs the organizations. It's if we are talking about climate changes. It affects minorities. It affects women. Whatever. What I'm begging you to do, because European Commission did last time in 2011 business case for diversity study, because they couldn't put equality between, if you change your working forces, your human resources, you can change it. The product will change. But they couldn't establish equality or the final result. Therefore, your profit will get up. They stopped doing that analysis. We've been begging all sorts of donors, give us the money to do this research, because everyone needs to understand that business case for diversity doesn't mean only making a profit. It means getting credibility, getting the audience. Only today there was decolonization of global news in this room, and they talked again about why you are talking about business case of diversity. You don't understand journalism. You're not a real journalist if you don't understand equality. It's not about it. It's like understanding what diversity can bring you. Please, Mira, of the forum, just try to do this kind of study. We can help with academics to do the methodology. This is really needed for all kinds of media, including the platforms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the issue of the intersectionality between diversity and gender, and this is one actually that I wanted to put to you, because sometimes it confuses me, to be very honest. I sometimes feel like diversity is being put forward to sort of shun gender aside. Often the intersectionality is not clear and not showcased enough or highlighted enough. How do you see this relationship between diversity and gender?
I mean, it's one and the same, and you can't talk about equality. You can't talk about gender equality. When you're talking about that, you're talking about all genders, and recognizing too that it's not. We're not talking about binary men and women.
Yes, I
we're
made a
also
mistake
talking.
there.
Yeah, I was going to say something. I know
it's
but,
Saturday,
but,
7
but
o'clock.
it
my
is,
brain.
and but I think
that,
it's also recognizing our sort of ingrained. Habits and being aware and talking about it and recognizing that you might not be fully aware or comfortable talking about different elements of what constitutes diversity, and so it fully deserves a robust conversation. I think in this context we are talking about gender. We're talking about 50% of the population. That is one large group, and there is intersectionality within that, and for every statistic that comes out for, a Caucasian woman that is under some sort of form of abuse or harassment, it is far worse for a person of color. And so, it's important to recognize that and, not ourselves get caught in that box.
Would anyone else like to comment on that?
Just about the study that Melissa mentioned. We won't necessarily talk about profit, but what we are doing right now is we're updating the media ownership monitor, which we did with Reporters Without Borders. So looking at the transparency of ownership, how much money is being put into it, who are the owners, etc., and who are the funders. And in parallel, within the same Dutch-funded project, we are conducting a very thorough study on the respect of social and economic rights of journalists in terms of salary scale, how frequently they get their salary paid. Is there any policy for salaries, gender equality within the salary scale, but also photographers, all the people working in the media sector. So even if it will not give us a clear number on profit, we will be conducting a comparison to see any correlation between level of transparency related to ownership and respect of the individual rights of the workers in the media industry, and another one related to how whether diversity at the level of donors, at the level of funders and owners reflect also into a broader respect of socioeconomic rights within. So it's not fully what Milica mentioned,
right,
but it will give a lot of indication, because money matters. When we speak in dollar figures, very often this conversation gets us in to rooms other than this one.
It's true. Can I think we have time for one short question. If anybody has one, I can take, yes, but brief, please.
Okay, just to be clear. My name is Mira Milosevic. I'm the co-founder of Syrian Female Journalist Network, and this year we're going to move to be a feminist media foundation, because we want to get out of when we talk about gender or women, and we are not talking about women. And my question also coming from 10 years experience in this field, like when we talk about gender in the media sector, we end up talking about women journalists have to study more, have to fight for their rights, and we're talking how then they can position themselves within the sector, but we don't talk about how to change. And then we don't talk about our men and male actually calling what to do. And I think we are repeating a vicious circle of all the activists and feminists. They are trying to change, but within the system, and I think it's a lost cause sometimes, and it's very exhausting, especially for the women journalist, feminist, researcher, etc., who is talking for them from inside. And today I appreciate a lot of things have been brought to the discussion, but also I felt like at the end we are talking about, again, what's the burden we are putting on women in the sector, more than like how we can change a little bit the system. Even, I mean, it's a long fight, but if there is any kind of example like how we are changing the narrative about that, rather than what women journalists or women in the sector they can do.
Yeah. So this putting most of the burden on women, and we have a saying in Egypt: a woman can be like 100 men. So you really have to be 100 men, not even one or two, to be able to sort of prove yourself. And that's the kind of pressure. And so I hear you. Can you answer to that, please?
Yes, hi Rula. It's very nice to see you, and thank you for that question. I think it's important, going back to that my previous comment on how we run our organizations. And one of the things that we are doing within our organizations is try to now design the structure, governance, and everything else where diversity is by design. It's not an add-on. It's not something that is an afterthought. But it's by design, and it's inside all the policy structures and everything we do, and it's natural. Now we have a problem that we have a diversity disbalance, and we need to hire more men and different other genders. Yes.
Would anyone else like briefly to add to that?
I would just add to that we recognize that certainly within the Women in News program, and the predominant sort of group of individuals that we work with, because we do work with management and top management, are men. And our number one message is, this is not on the individual to change. You are in the position of power. It's your responsibility and your opportunity to make this a place that encourages, equality for everyone and the opportunity for everyone to succeed. So we really do try to drive that home. Recognizing as well that helping to build the confidence and the skills and the networks of women to succeed once they do progress, that also is there's a balance. But you're absolutely right. The onus should not be on the underprivileged.
Yeah. Ayman, would you like to add anything to
Nothing
that?
at this point.
All right, unfortunately, we are out of time, so I must bring this to a close. If you would join me in thanking our experts today and our panelists on the fantastic session. That was a long clap. And thank you to all of you for being with us this evening.